It's a new day on Deep Space Nine and Dax is talking to Morn, not that Morn has any idea who she is. It's not the only discord she's experienced between old life and new. Seeing the place Jadzia was mortally wounded is a bit much, as is being served the same batch of blood wine as Jadzia's wedding to Worf, not least of which because this new body can't stand the stuff. It's all so much that Dax has decided hanging around would probably be unwise, so she's going back to the ship she was on when she got emergency joined. A lot of that is due to how raw things still are for those around her, something best indicated by Worf leaving whenever he sees her. In fact, Worf's the main reason Dax gives when she tells Sisko she'll be leaving. That he can't bring himself to even talk to her, despite knowing the Trill taboo only covers relationships, shows just how much he's suffering, and she doesn't want to make it worse. To Quark's we go, where O'Brien, Bashir and Odo are discussing a holosuite program. Plain simple Garak's there too, and in between being distracted by the crowd, disappoints them about costumes to wear as he's far too busy for tailoring. Starfleet's had him decrypting Cardigan military transmissions, and perhaps the amount of it has made him on edge as he shouts at the crowd for being too close before leaving. There's clearly something more serious going on, as when Odo visits him later, a plain simple Garak collapses in his shop. It's his claustrophobia, apparently, something we learned about a few seasons back, and it's recently been so bad that even large open rooms are becoming an issue. Obviously, that's not good for his concentration, which is why he needs to put the decrypting on hold till he can sort himself out. Luckily, we now have a counselor on the station. Well, assistant counselor. That was Ezri's job back on her old ship, which means it's now Dax's, I suppose. Sisko wants her to have a talk with plain simple Garak, as the work he's doing is particularly important now the fight has moved to Cardigan space. Dax is unconvinced that she's capable, but is willing to give it a go. Giving it a go is what Quark plans to do from the sounds of things. He's talking to Bashir about the return of Dax, and as the two of them pined over the previous host, he thinks this is another shot. He even wants to make a game out of it, and Bashir, trying to dismiss the idea, simply isn't getting through to him. The therapy session is what you'd call a mixed bag, mostly because it also ends up being therapy for Dax. She's been getting space sick since joining and thinks it's due to a former host dying in a shuttle accident. More specifically, she thinks it's because of guilt about him getting himself killed by being less than safe during a test. By a handy coincidence, blaming yourself for the actions of another might be what's causing plain simple Garak's issue. His dad, the legendary and now deceased Inarbran Tain of the Obsidian Order, would lock him in a closet as punishment. Plain simple Garak considers it a fair way of disciplining him for his behaviour, which Dax compares with her own attitude of guilt. Plain simple Garak doesn't seem entirely sold on the idea, but thanks her anyway. It's still a better interaction than the one Dax has with Worf. He talks to her this time, but only to tell her that she's nothing to do with his dead wife, and he has no desire to speak further. Not a spectacular result, but 1 out of 2 isn't bad, I suppose. Sisko pops round to give her the news that plain simple Garak's back to work decoding transmissions. Sisko's also not impressed when he hears how Worf handled things and says Dax has as much right to be here as anyone. In fact, Sisko would like her to stay. He's so convinced by it that he even got in touch with Starfleet, who subsequently advanced her to full counselor and promoted her to lieutenant. His argument that she now has 300 years of experience won them over, though by that logic they should have made her a fleet admiral. She thanks him for the gesture, but says she's still not sold on the idea of staying, largely because of Worf. Perhaps Bashir can convince her to stay. He joins her at the Replimat as she's struggling to decide what she wants. Maybe he's been pondering that conversation with Quark too, as Dax thinks he's flirting and tells him to stop. Then she says that, had Worf not appeared on the scene, Jadzia Dax would probably have jumped him, which is somewhat of a mixed message given the flirting comment. Taking his hand is another, but perhaps in aid of her job this time, as she asks if he misses Jadzia. Not that Worf will likely see it this way, as he's watching them both. Probably just as well, then, that it's broken up by an emergency call for Bashir. It would appear plain simple Garak's claustrophobia isn't quite as under control as we thought, which is why he was trying to get a little space for himself in a very literal sense, by opening an airlock. Dax and Plain Simple Garak are on a cliff in front of a wide open ocean, except no they're not, as they're really in a cramped holosuite, a fact Plain Simple Garak notes with some discomfort. Still, he's doing better than he was, so Dax says she'll make sure a holosuite is available to him round the clock. Down in the infirmary, Worf's visiting Bashir, and by visiting, I mean forcing him up against a wall and providing unspecified threats if he goes near Dax again after seeing them together earlier. Bashir tries to argue the point, but Worf's not listening. He's not the only one. Plain Simple Garak has decided Dax's treatment can bugger off, and he's instead trying to keep busy. He's also taking his anger out on her when she tries to help again, saying she's nothing but a poor shadow of the woman he knew and unworthy of the name. Dax chooses the place Jadzia got fried by a par-wraith to have a bit of a cry, which is a curious choice considering. Maybe the location had an impact on her decision to leave Starfleet, as she's now delivering her resignation letter to Sisko. Plain Simple Garak was right, she thinks. A counsellor with more problems than her patients is of no use to anybody. She balks at Sisko using the nickname from 2 hosts ago, and at the idea that she'll adapt in time. So Sisko acts like a dick to her as well, and says the symbiont will have to put up with 1 shitty life after 8 good ones, which is a bit unfair when one of those 8 was a fucking murderer. He says she doesn't deserve being either joined or a member of Starfleet, and accepts her resignation before throwing her out. With so many people being arseholes, it's O'Brien who decides he should try and sort one of them out. Worf isn't pleased to see him, but that's Worf's standard setting. At least he has the sense to realise moving straight to the part where they talk will get rid of O'Brien quicker. The nub of it is that Worf hates people treating Ezri like Jadzia and says it's pissing on her memory. O'Brien's of the opinion that treating Ezri like a pariah is what does Jadzia a disservice. Besides, if he wants to know what Jadzia would have wanted, there's somebody who can tell him for sure, assuming she can tune into the right memories anyway. He'll have to be quick as she's leaving tomorrow. She's having one final visit to see Plain Simple Garak before it happens, mostly to apologise for being shite at her job. That's why she won't be joining her old ship as it heads to Cardigan space, coincidentally to join an attack based on Plain Simple Garak's decrypted messages. That news leaves him struggling, and Dax tries talking to him some more. It just makes things worse as he's working through the knowledge that Cardigans are dying because of him. Even knowing that his actions will shorten the war doesn't help, because the Dominion will make sure Cardassia doesn't give up until it's nothing but ruins. He collapses again after calling himself a traitor, and Dax summons help. Plain Simple Garak is in the infirmary, though he's doing a lot better after realising his claustrophobia was caused by guilt about what's happening to his people. He also apologises to Dax, who's now decided she's not going to leave Starfleet after all. Handy then that Sisko never sent her resignation. He was being a dick to provoke her into action, which didn't actually work when you consider she was saying goodbye when Plain Simple Garak had his latest attack, but neither of them seem to care, so let's ignore it for now. She's still leaving DS9 though, so they say goodbye. Or not. Worf visits while Dax is preparing to go and apologises for being an arsehole as well. He's still all kinds of chewed up about her storing the ghost of his dead wife, but thinks he can work through it eventually and says she should stay if it's what she wants. So she does. The party celebrating both her decision and her promotion to junior grade lieutenant is attended by all. Even Worf shows up, though keeps his distance, so we'll leave Dax to settle back into some of the grooves of her former host until the next adventure. The inevitable new Dax episode then. You can't switch out a member of the cast and not address it as soon as you've dealt with whatever story was already ongoing, so this was an obvious choice for what to do after the 2-parter. Not particularly surprising then in both premise and execution, as there's really not many other ways to slot Dax 2.0, or 9.0 I suppose, back into the show. Still, it does the job competently enough, and we still get a nod towards the ongoing Dominion War arc with Plain Simple Garak's inclusion, so it's not all housekeeping. Besides, the story also covers something we discussed last season. In The Sound of Her Voice, the crew's need of an outlet for their mental health was explored, so Dax becoming that makes sense. A lack of counsellor so far from home was arguably an oversight to begin with, and that's before it became the fleet base closest to the front line of a war. Not that Dax is really up to the task, if we're being ungenerously honest. She doesn't so much help plain simple Garak as stumble across the underlying cause while halfway through the process of giving up. Not exactly a sterling start for DS9's only mental health professional, but I think it's fair to say she's got other stuff on her mind at the moment, or other minds on her mind. A Dax episode often means a Trill episode, and this one's no different. We get quite a few little details here and there with wider implications for the species, some of which tie into stuff we've discussed previously. There's a throwaway line with Quark, for example, where Dax says he owes her 10 strips of latinum from a game of Cardi Spin Cash. It's likely put in there just for the lols, but it touches on something we've mentioned before about what happens to the property of a deceased host, and, by extension, other legal issues. The show itself shied away from answering this back in Season 1, when we refused to rule on whether Jadzia Dax was liable for the alleged crimes of Curzon Dax. Sisko seemed of the opinion that the answer was no, and I'm inclined to agree, but today's episode isn't the first example of a new host feeling they're tied to prior events. Jadzia Dax's murder sabbatical was the result of a blood oath from Curzon after all, despite the Klingons involved arguing it died with him. But is that attitude, and this one of claiming a debt for a past host, indicative of the norm for Trill? We know there's a strong rule against hooking up with the partner of a former host, but anything else appears up to the individual. So is Ezri Dax entitled to the money won by Jadzia Dax, or does it go elsewhere? Is it Worf's, as he's the next of kin? Would Jadzia's family have a claim for anything obtained after joining? Come to think of it, does a joined Trill have a legal claim to any of the property the host had before they were joined, as they're separate entities? 7 seasons in, and we've still not touched on the potential pitfalls of a society where a small portion of the population experience a form of immortality. I'm not sure whether to be disappointed by that, or happy that it's still providing me with questions to ponder. Speaking of which, we get another one with how Dax is treated by Starfleet Medical. Sisko argues that Dax's 300 years of experience means she should not only skip the training period of her job, but also be promoted. Is that a savvy use of available resources, tapping the knowledge held in one of your crew? Or just another type of old boys club where the favoured members get to bypass the route everybody else has to follow? And where does that logic end? I joked about making her a flag officer, but, well, if we're saying Emily's experience as a gymnast and Tobin's knowledge of engineering make Ezri a better counsellor, then maybe Duran's experience as a fucking psychopath means she really is qualified to be an admiral. We'll do one last observation about Trill before we move on, as we're close to banging a broken drum at this point. During this episode, Sisko's a dick to Dax as a method of provoking her into action, and says it's something Dax has done to him many times before. Putting to one side the fact that this didn't actually work if you realise she was still in the process of leaving when the story resolved itself, the idea does raise an interesting question. At what point can the actions of a new host be so predicted by those familiar with the old one that you're essentially just the same person? To put it another way, if you're making a soup, how many ingredients need to be present before adding another one makes no real difference to the flavour? Do symbionts have a host limit before new hosts add nothing of significance except a fresh body to drive? In short, is becoming a Goa'uld inevitable if a symbiont lives long enough? Let's end this one with a rare example of more effort by the production team arguably being a bad thing. I'm talking about the scene where plain simple Garak's trying to bash his way out of an airlock. Somebody went to the trouble of showing the station reflected in the window, presumably because it was a lot cheaper than a composite shot with him superimposed onto the model. It's a nice touch and a show of initiative from someone involved, which makes me feel somewhat guilty for pointing out that it's also wrong. I'm assuming from the position and angle of the station reflection that we're saying plain simple Garak is in the docking port of an upper pylon. The pylons are the only external airlocks facing towards the station, and the lack of a glowing red shaft in the central core means we're looking at the top, not the bottom. And that means the core of the station would be directly perpendicular to the face of the airlock door, so reflected only when looking at the window face on. Our viewpoint is between 30 and 45 degrees by my estimation, so the angles just don't work. We're also seeing more of the station than we really should from a pylon as the tips reach over the habitat ring. What's even more regrettable is that this shot would have worked if we'd instead seen the next docking pylon instead of the whole station. It feels vaguely mean to point out all of this when somebody clearly put in more effort than was necessary for the shot, kind of like punishing someone for baking you an extra cake, but all I could think of when I saw it was, hold on, that's not right. Perhaps that response of mine is an example of we nerds sometimes having unrealistic expectations compared to what's possible in the real world. There's a reason why these videos were originally titled Reviewed by an Arsehole, and it serves us well to remember that not all complaints are equally valid. End of episode.
Still on the bus then, I see.
Maybe he's preparing a big reveal.
Oh, like he did for the first internet shot, you mean?
Fair point.
I don't see what's so difficult. If these social media things are so popular, you'd think he could whip up a background in a few minutes.
Perhaps the sheer quantity and diversity of things on offer is what's making it so hard to find a coherent theme.
Or he's just shit at the job. Hold up, we've stopped. Let's go take a look.
Space Dog, when we got onto our search engine back in the GeoCity, what exactly did you tell it to do?
I think I said I wanted to go to the most famous social media place in the world.
On reflection, perhaps we should do a little research before we decide on a destination. Woof.